All right, so today we're going to go over some review at the beginning of the slideshow, and then we'll get into Bleeding Kansas and Preston, or Summer versus Brooks, and what happens in the congressional beatdown that just leads to more tension and violence between the North and the South. I don't know if you can hear that, but I hear a timer going off, tick, 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 leading us to a great big giant explosion called the Civil War. I just put this slide in there just to remind you of what the South Society breakdown was. We put this in our notebook. So just view it and then move on when ready. Again, more review. If you remember that we have our three great grand divisions in Tennessee: East, Middle, and West. East, where there is very little slavery; West, where there is a lot of slavery; and in the middle, there is a mixture of slavery and no slavery, depending on whether you have the geography. If you have large fields, you're probably going to have slavery. If you don't, then you probably won't. This is just a precursor to what's going to happen inside of our state when we finally hit the Civil War next week. Really can't talk enough about the growth of the nation moving out to the West with the new addition of territory. Comes the question of whether that territory will be slave or free, and that is the only thing that people are thinking about at this particular time. And after California comes in as a free state, it's going to land on the shoulders of the people of Kansas to decide whether they are going to be a slave or a free state. When you talk about popular sovereignty, that's the people getting to decide what they want, and that the political power belongs with the people. And I currently have my hand over my head saying power to the people because I kind of believe in it, but there are some definite drawbacks to letting the majority of the people decide what they want to do. And that can lead to the infringement of people's basic civil liberties. So maybe popular sovereignty isn't always the best, but yet maybe it has its place. Things to think about. So we talked briefly before we went away on our hiatus a little bit about the Wilmot Proviso, that there were certain things going on in Mexican Cession territory that the United States agreed to protect rights of women in the area, and that there was no slavery currently in the Mexican Cession territory. So Wilmot writes a law that says that it's going to ban slavery in Mexican Cession territory because that's what we agreed to with Mexico. And you know that the House passed it, and it doesn't pass in the Senate. So I'm wondering if you know why. Something else to think about. Here's a hint. It didn't pass through the Senate because we are currently in a even split between free and slave states. So from this addition to territory in the United States moving out westward comes this idea that there are people who believe in free soil. Free soil doesn't refer to the giving away of large amounts of dirt. It refers to people who live on territory where there is no slavery. Kansas will be one of those places, and many free soilers live in Kansas. So we'll discuss the free soilers, but the main premise behind the Free Soil Party is the abolition of slavery. So, with that knowledge, how do you think free soilers would have felt about the Wilmot Proviso, which happened on the slide right before this? And the Wilmot Proviso was trying to do what with slavery? And would the free soilers would have supported the Wilmot Proviso? I'll give you a second to think about it, and the answer will come down in 3 seconds. definitely the Free Soil Party, who supported no slavery, would have been all in on the Wilmot Proviso. Very good, class. So we have the Compromise of 1850, and I can read through the slide for you, one, two, three, four, five, but I think that you need to really know that the two major points would be that California came in as a free state, and that they agreed to a Fugitive Slave Act that would be enforced throughout the country. And without those two things, that the Compromise of 1850 would have been a lost relic, and nobody would ever be talking about it today. Always don't forget that Senor Clay from the great state of, that's right, Kentucky, is the person who proposed it, and that he is about to die. So this will be his last act in Congress. Once again, with the Fugitive Slave Act, we can see the problems with American society and people who make deals. And if you're looking for morality, I hope that you don't look for it from our United States government, because they do things like this. So only whites can testify. I don't know if this slide should say enslaved Africans cannot. It should say African Americans cannot, because some free Americans were found to be slaves against their will and sent back. Anybody who was in the North or the South who helped hide slaves or helped them get away would be fined or put in jail. And then you can see there's a great big giant disparity between a judge finding for someone to be a free person with only $5 being paid, or $10 for a person to be found a slave in there. So the reactions are pretty simple from the North. People were really upset. They really didn't care about slavery that much. They didn't really focus on it very much. They thought it was a Southern issue that had nothing to do with them. But they're going to feel like they are now complicit, which means part of the slave trade. And they don't like that. The South feels like that they're going to get their property back. That's a terrible way to say it, but that's what they felt. They felt like the Northerners didn't support them, and now that that law was in place, that they would support them. So, question for you would be, would you break the law in order to help someone escaping slavery, knowing the penalties? And that's a hard one to answer from our seats today. We are coming down to the end of the review real quick, and you have Uncle Tom's Cabin, which sold 2 million copies for a book in the United States of about 30 million people, which is really, really a large number of books to be sold. It's written by Harriet Beecher Stowe, and Abraham Lincoln will call her the little lady who started a civil war. And the perception is people from the North will think that this is the way slavery actually is every day. And people from the South will say that it's pure propaganda, and this doesn't happen in the South. And stories very quickly is about a slave who grows up on a plantation who generally has a pretty good life. I hate to say that when it comes to slavery, but he works in the house and he gets along with the plantation owner. And then it comes to a point in time where that plantation owner sells Uncle Tom to a very mean man who ends up over the course of time beating Uncle Tom to death. And that is the story, and that is the controversy. So this is something that I'm not going to make you take notes on today, but in the election of 1852, we're 9 years away from Civil War, and there needs to be a compromise in the election. and Pierce is going to run, and he is from the North, and he's not particularly a fan of slavery, but he wants to be president of the United States even more. So he promises the South that he will support the Fugitive Slave Act and the Compromise of 1850. And with that promise, the South will support Pierce, even though he is from up north, and he wins in a landslide. And he will become your president based on that bargain. Really, nothing to say on this slide. Just read it and move on to the next one. So as Kansas gets closer to becoming an actual state, Kansas will hold the election, and many people from all over the nation, once they hear that popular sovereignty is going to take place, are going to move into Kansas, and they're going to vote in the election, and there will be no residency requirements. So people don't have to live in the state for an X amount of days before they vote, and when they vote and after they vote, they end up going home to their homes, and they will leave Kansas in the state that they voted in. And it's going to cause some big problems because the people from Kansas are going to feel like outsiders made a decision for this state that they generally don't agree with. Start all over. All right, class, this is the second time around on this one. I'm going to try to talk a little bit faster because we ran out of time. But if you take a look at it, that person in the chair being tied down looks very familiar, like a very famous American. Maybe it might be a representation of Abraham Lincoln, who was sometimes called an abolitionist. The people who were forcing the slave down the throat of the free soiler and pulling the hair back would be Southern Democrats who were in favor of slavery. And this really just represents that the average everyday person in Kansas did not want slavery, and slavery was literally, in this cartoon, being forced down the throat of free soilers who lived in Kansas. For those of you who got that, I'm proud of you. All right, on this slide, I think it's probably most important that you just realize that the people in the North were upset because they felt like the Compromise of 1820 and the using of the southern boundary of Missouri was already a dividing line between free and slave territory, and that the Compromise of 1850 and using popular sovereignty again in Kansas and the Kansas-Nebraska Act was a violation of that policy that was already a longstanding division between free and slave states. Bleeding Kansas comes into play after the election. Most of the people, I think that you'll take it in your notes today, and you heard yesterday, most of the people of Kansas were poor white farmers. That does not lend itself to slavery at all. The ground in Kansas is extremely difficult to farm, and it takes an awful lot of work, and these people have no money. The reason why they settled there was because land was free or extremely cheap because nobody wanted to buy it. So after the election, there are two governments set up in Kansas, one pro-slavery and one free soil government, and the two governments start passing laws, and this leads to a violent reaction inside of Kansas between pro-slavery and abolitionist forces in Kansas, and there will be pro-slavery forces who ride into the town of Lawrence and ransack it and burn it down to the ground. And in return, the very famous American named John Brown comes in, and he kills 5 slave owners in the middle of the night. While they beg for their lives, he puts a gun to their head, and he pulls the trigger because John Brown believes that if you are a slave owner, you deserve to die right then and there. This is John Brown. Again, if you want to move around and see if John Brown's eyes follow you, feel free, but I'm going to let you a second to stare at John Brown. and pretend that you are a farmer in Kansas who owns slaves, and this man shows up at your doorstep in the middle of the night, drags you out in front of your family, puts a gun to your head, and tells you he's going to kill you. Do you think for a second that if you looked into this man's eyes and you asked for mercy, he's going to give it to you? He's not. And he will kill 5 people in front of their families in the middle of the night because he knows in his mind that he is appointed by God, that he is to wipe slavery off the face of the earth. And if that means the death of slave owners, then that's what it means. So in this picture of John Brown, you definitely see the American and the Confederate side. And I'm curious, who painted this picture? Somebody who was for John Brown or somebody who was against John Brown? And then see if you can support your answer with details from the painting, and then you'll make a decision. This particular painting, all sorts of different things. You guys have looked at paintings all year, so hopefully you've learned what you see in the picture and what you think the picture actually means. So we have Summer versus Brooks, which I like to call the congressional beatdown, and it's pretty simple. You put this in your own way of thinking. So Summer is from the north and Brooks is from the south, and Summer goes ahead and goes into the United States Congress, and he talks smack about Brooks's uncle, and he says some hurtful things. When Brooks finds out about it, he comes in and he has a cane in his hand and he beats down Summer from the north. Within an inch of his life, it takes Summer almost a year to recover from his injuries, and people from the South are gonna say, maybe you shouldn't talk about people if you can't back it up, which I totally get. I mean, you talk about my mom or my uncle, there's going to be problems. And people from the North are going to say, look, people from the South are just full of violence. Look what they did to that poor man, beat him within an inch of his life. And again, that divide between the North and the South is going to grow, and people are going to stop being civil to each other. And people from the South will send Brooks a whole bunch of canes and show their support for what he did, because you really shouldn't be talking about someone's family unless you're willing to back it up. And also, class violence is never the answer. I wonder which way you're going to go with. Believe it or not, this is not an actual photograph of the congressional beatdown between Summer and Brooks, but there is a hidden message in here that is an old saying that has been around for a very, very long time. And I wonder if you could see what it is. I'll give you a couple of seconds. Also, look at the background and the people in the back. Look at the way that the 2 characters are portrayed. And if you notice that quill pen in the right hand, some might say that the pen is mightier than the sword. Yahoo! So, class, we're at the end, and I originally would show this in class and ask you not to blurt out, but only think about it. But since nobody is around anybody who's going to know the answers, feel free to blurt out as much as you like. The Kansas-Nebraska Act. How much do you know about it? Think about it. Hopefully, you said something about popular sovereignty and the right of the people to decide for themselves whether there would be slavery or not, and how the South felt and how the North felt. And maybe you mentioned who the good people of Kansas were. Maybe you didn't. The Wilmot Proviso. This would be something to do with territory added in the West, maybe called Mexican Cession Land, and the banning of slavery. That's right. I knew you could do it. Maybe the only thing that I would want you to know about the election of 1852 is that Pierce makes a deal to support the Fugitive Slave Act and the or the Compromise of 1850, and he gets elected president with support of the Southerners, even though he is from New Hampshire. The Missouri Compromise, pretty simple. California will enter as a free state. The slave trade will be banned in Washington, D.C., but slavery will still be allowed. Popular sovereignty will be used to help decide the issue of slavery in the territories of New Mexico and Utah, which that will never happen because of the problems that happened in Kansas. The Fugitive Slave Act will be enforced nationally, become federal law, and that Henry Clay is the person who came up with this great compromise. All right, class, popular sovereignty, I think is our last slide. Let me check real quick while you're thinking about what it means. And I do believe this is our last slide. So score. Power to the people. The people get to decide for themselves. Sometimes a good idea, sometimes not.